GM. We're back here with the CEO of SEDA, Peter, and our guest for today is Jim, former founder of Catalyst, now, if I'm correct, head of product or driving Catalyst product under the Lifi banner, which is very exciting. Jim, great to have you here.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Excited to chat.
Yeah, and plenty of things
Same
to talk
here.
about. I mean, I think the whole Interop space was very excited to see Lifi's acquisition of Catalyst and sort of see some of the blogs that came out from Philip on what it means. But I think for the most part, we're all very keen to learn a little bit deeper what it means and sort of the direction for yourself driving Catalyst under Lifi, Pioneer, which was announced as well, and then sort of the general direction of Interop. We don't normally do the introductions here on the space, but you've had quite a run since I've been looking back at some of your podcasts. You were originally the product manager at Aave, and then you dove into Interop, and that led you to Catalyst, and now you've been acquired, which is a massive step and a really positive sum experience, I guess, for the whole space that we are moving forward and big things are happening. So on this one-off, I would love to get a bit of a brief rundown on your history from Aave to now.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll be very brief. I'm also not a introduction maxi. So I've worked in crypto for 8 years full time. 7 years full time. I don't math good, but I started off as a product manager at Ripple, post during the ICO boom and post ICO boom up until DeFi summer. And then afterwards, I wanted to build on Ethereum, didn't want to be in Ripple anymore, didn't want to talk to banks. And so I left and I joined Aave as a product manager and was there for about 2 years. And then in late 2022, I left and I was super interested in cross-chain. I had a vision that there was going to be a shit ton of chains, and lo and behold, there were. And I wanted to build in cross-chain, so I started a cross-chain bridge company / protocol with my co-founder Alexander. And yeah, we built it for 2.5 years and we got acquired by Lifi about 2 months ago. And yeah, now I'm the head of product at Lifi, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been a great journey. And I think Catalyst I really want to start the conversation around Catalyst prior to the Lifi acquisition. I was actually trying to go into some of your documentation, but I see that it's being rewritten, I guess, as part of the acquisition. And all the links were pointing me to the withdrawing
yes,
site.
We are. We'd sunsetted the existing smart contract. So getting folks to withdraw, pointing every domain we can to the withdrawal page.
Yeah, it's a good strategy, 100%. So let's dive into it. Catalyst, from my memory, was it was the bridge for alt VMs, right? Like you weren't focusing on EVM, you were focusing more on alt VMs, and you were sort of leading, I guess, alt VM bridges under the permissionless banner, under using solver intent systems. I'd love to hear your 1,000-foot view of Catalyst prior to what it means to Lifi.
So I'd like to think of Catalyst as two separate things in many ways. So, well, I mean, they both ladder up to one thing, but Catalyst as a product is an intent-based bridge, right? And so not too dissimilar to other intent-based bridges that we see right now. I think the only difference is that we made different design choices such that it is natively cross VM or VM agnostic. So it's cross VM, right? And that allowed us to be able to swap to other VMs like alt VMs, Move, Solana, Wasm chains, etc. Also allowed us to go to chains that didn't have VMs like Bitcoin, Ripple, some others. And so that was the product that we built. I think Catalyst as a idea or as a brand was the bridge for alt VMs. And we deliberately decided to do that because, and I had a long post about it, we were basically zagging while everyone is zigging, where there was more and more competition within EVM. We wanted to go where there were greener pastures, so to speak, and more opportunity to gain market share. And so we saw a gap in the markets for alt VMs, and we wanted to target it basically. actually, I don't even want to frame it like we saw something. We basically just talked to a bunch of builders, a bunch of roll-up builders and chain builders. We're saying, hey, where do you want to get connected to? And the resounding feedback was that they wanted to go to alt VMs, and they felt like they had plenty of options, more than enough options from the EVM perspective. So that was kind of our like strategic focus.
And
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was just gonna say, like, for us back in 2021 and 2022, we all saw the same sort of realization that builders were, in desperate need of oracles on these newer networks, and the sort of like top 5 EVM networks were sort of very saturated with Oracle already. And the new chains like desperately needed Oracle data and desperately needed customizability. So I think that, that was also a big realization that we had, that we wanted to sort of go to these green pastures and make sure that we serve, customers that were there, had sort of, ambitious ideas that they were building, but couldn't get access to data. And I think that, it's a very good realization that you guys had as well with Catalyst.
Yeah, I think the long tail play makes a lot of sense in hindsight. I certainly think in 2021, 2022, that was not consensus. Right? They're like,
Yeah,
there's chains, but yeah, how many of them can it really be, right? And lo and
Yeah,
behold, we have like
exactly.
over 300 now.
Right. Yeah, like
Yeah,
back then, like having 10 was going to be like way too many, right? And no one could see past there might being like maybe 20 chains in total. Back in 2021, for sure, it was like a contrarian take back then.
Is that fair to say that you're you're an early predictor of chain abstraction? I'm not sure when you started to build Catalyst, and I don't think I've heard you speak too much on chain abstraction in some of the podcasts that I listened back on. We had a chain abstraction war room with sort of 10 of the projects that were building chain abstraction, and the meme takeaway was that chain abstraction is not real. But of course, since then we've all been deploying left, right, and center. But given that you're building that you were building Catalyst as an intent-based bridge to these alt VMs, that must have been like an early prediction of yours that sort of builders are going to want to get connected to these alt VMs, and that sort of the message-based bridge framework isn't the best way to do it or the fastest way to do it. Well, what was kind of your thinking that led you to go alt VMs? Obviously, talk to the builders, but then to go with an intent-based framework.
Yeah. On the chain abstraction piece, it's hard to say when I was involved in chain abstraction, certainly pre-crowning of a name for it, so to speak, right? We were building an intent. I think it was intent first, and then chain abstraction kind of followed, and chain abstraction is a slightly bigger superset of intents that includes wallets and smart wallets and stuff like that. And intents is more or less of a cross-chain concept, or I guess you can also generalize it to a same chain concept, like what Anoma does. But yeah, we were building in it, and we certainly had that vision before it had a word. Some of our early vision docs say we want to make sure all chains are unified or something like that, chain unification, which didn't stick. Not as cool, I guess, of a word. So it's hard to say, but I think anyone that's been building an interop for the past few years, they can probably have the same answer as me. So I'm not really unique in that regard.
Yeah,
as it pertains to, sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think like back in the day, it used to be called like multi-chain, like multi-chain native was sort of like the what now it's turned into like chain abstraction at this point, right? Like and sort
Yeah.
of like cross-chain,
Yeah. I actually take the opposite side of maybe your war room takeaway. And I'd say chain abstraction is really real, like more real than I think people give it credit for. I think we are all driving towards chain abstraction as some ideal, something that's like always slightly in the horizon. And I think we're going to look back and say, yeah, in 2025, we already had that, quite frankly, in many ways. Maybe it wasn't mainstream, but it's certainly available. Like the apps that I use have chain abstraction in many ways. At least, it becomes a semantic argument more than anything, I think. But back to Catalyst. So we actually started off in EVM. So we started off in EVM.
Okay.
And we actually started off building an AMM mechanism. And so it looked conceptually very similar to Stargate, but it was built for permissionless deployments. So you can deploy new instances of this AMM within different chains, and you can actually peer with different chains permissionlessly. And so that was kind of our pitch, right? We were the long tail permissionless version of Stargate as a bridge. Why we changed our tune later on is that this is post mainnet launch for our AMM product that we call Catalyst V1. We realized that it was underperforming based on these new mechanisms that we're seeing, and that was Intents, right? So we certainly were not new to the Intents design or Intents discussion, but and we also realized that the EVM space had become at that point incredibly crowded, right? And so we did a bit of soul searching and talked to a bunch of builders and came up with a takeaway of building on alt VMs. And so we scrapped V1, we built V2, which we called Crosscats. It was cross VM agnostic. And we had a whole new go-to-market, and we launched on mainnet in the fall of last year. So that was kind of our thinking around Intents. It was just more competitive than AMM in many ways, or at least the ways that users care about. And we wanted to be on alt VMs because that's just where we saw less competition, where we saw a high desire from a builder perspective.
I mean, plenty of people saw value in that kind of vision, I think, as well, right? I mean, I was reading Philip's blog post the acquisition announcement, where he was talking about Pioneer being used as like a solver system, a centralized solver system to go to new chains very, very quickly, while Catalyst will then, from my understanding, then they'll use Catalyst's system to serve those new long tail chains afterwards. So I guess it's fair to say that you still hold that vision, or Lifi as well still holds that vision of thousands of chains. But I guess you're going one step beyond. There's this app chain thesis within the EVM, roll-up centric roadmap, roll-ups as a service, and all the clusters that's growing. Is that very much the vision of Lifi now, and the reason behind the acquisition was to use Catalyst system in order to basically power, I guess, expansion to new chains?
Yeah, definitely. The way I like to frame it is that I saw a problem that I wanted to solve before I started Catalyst. And it was such a big problem that I quit my job at Aave and I wanted to focus on it full time. And flash forward 2.5 years, I'm still focusing on that problem. I just have a lot more firepower now underneath the Lifi umbrella, right? And so that problem is, there's a few ways you can put it, right? I was going to say, how do you scalably connect all these chains, which is like kind of like a word salad. I prefer to say it like, hey, if you are a rollup builder and you launch your rollup and you have all these tools to launch your rollup, what do you do afterwards? Right? Like, how do you actually connect to other things of value? How do you actually build this new economy, right? You effectively built a city in the desert. How are you going to get people to come there and like buy your stuff and have services and work there and everything, right? So it's an economy building question ultimately. And I wanted to solve that problem because I had that problem at Aave, right? I was working on special projects at Aave. One of them was a proof of concept for Aave Chain and Go Chain and Lens Chain. And it was actually pretty easy to spin up these things, right? And this was even pre-OP stack, right? There was no names for these things. It was just, we're just forking stuff. We're just forking, OP Gath and forking Polygon POS, node clients and everything. And it was still easy. It's even easier now, right? With RAS services. But I think the really hard question is, what do you do afterwards? And so that was what we wanted to solve. That's what I tried to solve at Catalyst. V1 with the permissionless AMMs. We then switched to an intent-based structure, and now we're at Lifi, building Lifi 2.0, which has the same vision, but now it's morphed slightly, right? I think Catalyst still remains the same in terms of the protocol. I think Pioneer becomes really interesting because it's effectively a solver as a service, right? And so it is it has many horizons to it. So that's why it kind of gets articulated in different ways. But it starts off as a single solver bridge, right? And so it's a bridge, but there's only one solver for it. How it, I think, evolves is then you become one solver of this permissionless marketplace, and that's Catalyst, right? And then after that, what you can do is make it a solver as a service. And so you're not saying, hey, we're not only running a solve, you basically like diversify on both ends of the order flow marketplace, right? And so instead of saying, hey, like there's one source of order flow, one solver. And then you're saying, oh, there's multiple sources of order flow, one solver, right? And now it's like multiple sources of order flow, multiple solvers. And so for us, we want to effectively make Pioneer a solver as a service so that anyone can run a solver. And so if you're a new chain or team that's building a new chain and you launch, you can run Pioneer and you can get access to liquidity via Catalyst, right? And so that's kind of the suite of products that we're creating in order to allow people to basically solve that question finally, right? Finally, after 2.5 years, we get some answer towards that.
Yeah, it's super cool. I think it's like a very hard problem to solve for a lot of these builders that launch their new L1 or L2. Like, and we're seeing this over and over again. Like the network goes live, they have like this ecosystem of projects that are building, no liquidity is there, no builders can launch anything, and it's just a chicken and the egg problem, right? And I remember, I mean, same thing back for you probably when you were working at Aave back a few years ago. You know, the first sort of bridges like IBC and Rainbow Bridge from Ethereum to Near, like these are the first kind of instances of bridging, you know, that was a little bit more trustless and a little bit more safe for users. But, you know, in a big way, up until actually I think very recently, users are kind of trapped on that chain and either have to use like a centralized exchange to get off and get to another network. And the same thing for sort of like capital allocators, like, you know, moving your funds from one chain to another is like a big, you know, sort of trusted exercise that you have to do. And so I think that now we're actually starting to see you know, users and liquidity be able to flow between networks and applications without having such a big barrier to entry. And I think you know, probably over the past year, it's really come to fruition that we're able to see this at scale, you know, go from one network to another without this big blocker in between.
Yeah, that's why I say, depending on your definition for chain abstraction, we've achieved it, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I
it's
think
only in the last 8 months or so have we been seeing enough infrastructure in place to allow new teams to feel much more connected from day one after launching a new rollup.
exactly. Yeah. And I think you know, with RAS providers, like you said, it gets even easier because you can include that in your stack day zero, right? And you know, I think that the approach from Lifi is really interesting because it starts at the sort of top of the stack as an aggregator and slowly builds out the, you know, bridge infrastructure. Now, you know, as an example of the acquisition of Catalyst, like starts to build that infra to scale faster, right? And not just be reliant only on external bridges, but also with your own, you know, solutions. I want to dive a little bit deeper into Pioneer. I think that's really interesting. And I think that this is sort of one of the problems that we, with our new IVM product, have been, you know, hearing a lot of feedback from builders, you know, building networks is that they don't want to run the infrastructure themselves, right? They don't want to, you know, be building an L1, but then also try to figure out how to build like their own canonical bridge. I'd love to hear, you know, sort of the vision for Pioneer. Right now, it sounds like this is a way for you guys to scale in a more sort of trusted way, but very quickly. And then eventually, as there's more demand and order flow, you move towards this more trustless system, you know, with Catalyst. What's sort of the you know, secret sauce there? Do you hopefully in the future, you know, sort of create a solver network where people can join and build, or is this sort of like a way to move very fast and then get, you know, more to a decentralized version after?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say the difference between working under the Lifi umbrella and being our own separate startup is that we effectively outsource a lot of our decision making to our customers, right? And what that means in practice for Lifi is that we get so much feedback And we have so many discussions with our customers, like Phantom and MetaMask and Robinhood Wallet and a bunch of others, right? So we have a lot of clarity on where they want to move their order flow, which is great. I think that's the number one thing that makes Lifi so powerful, is that it has so much order flow, because it has so much so many relationships, sorry, not good grammar right now, so many relationships with these customers that bring order flow through Lifi, right? And so for them, they have a lot of interest in either expanding new chains or getting access to new liquidity. And that helps us inform our roadmap, right? And so instead of us saying, hey, like, we need to build a solver network because it's cool, right? Or, you have to, put your finger against the wind and try to guess where some tailwinds might take the industry as an independent startup. There's actually a lot more clarity from a builder perspective from that, right? And so after being a founder, going to this context, it's actually kind of nice to know that there's more clarity around what we're building. And so
Right.
the answer for you is that our roadmap basically reflects their needs, right? And where they want to put their order flow. And we get to build in a certain way in anticipation for that, right? I think when you build independently, you kind of build an MVP first, and then you add a bunch of things. But here, we have a pretty good idea of what volume is going to be flowing through since day one. And so you can architect it with some level of scale and kind of lead, and push off a few more scalability things or initiatives later. And so single solver is first, right? That's certainly where we have feedback that is very helpful. Great for long tail, great for chain expansion, great for really small swaps, right? So that is really helpful. Over time, of course, you want to add more enterprise grade mechanisms around it. And so you can't really be a single solver bridge anymore. You have to be participating in some sort of decentralized order flow auction. And so Catalyst comes, and then Pioneer is kind of a part of it, right? And so that's kind of how we see the evolution. Now, going back to the customer side, we also get demands for relayers, right? And so this is less of a customer in the perspective of like a Phantom or something, but is more in the perspective of like chains, right? Chains ultimately become Lifi's customers too, because Lifi has order flow and chains want order flow, right? And so you kind of get into this really interesting relationship where chains would want access to their order flow, and then we basically provide tooling for them to get access to it, right? Where we're saying, hey, you can run Pioneer and you can actually put in your own liquidity, right? And so Pioneer is more than just solver as a service in the sense that you can run an instance of our solver. You can actually have on-chain, we call them relay pools, where people can deposit money and effectively use that for these solvers. And so chain teams can do that, and eventually any individual can do that as well. That's another kind of axis of our roadmap, so to speak.
Yeah, really cool. That's awesome. I think that like plays very well into a learning that we had a couple of years ago when we pivoted from building sort of a first party Oracle, that in a similar way to like what you guys were building with Catalyst in the beginning and also with Aave. You sort of had to prioritize chains, right? Which is very hard to do. And as you know, in crypto, things move so fast, right? Like all the hype is DYDX chain and Avo and things like that.
Yeah.
And then, a month later, no one cares. It's all hyperliquid, right? And hyperliquid's the hype, no pun intended now, but
Yeah.
in like 2 months, it might be something totally different. And so to architect your roadmap, like you said, like, it's much easier to build your roadmap when it's, based on customer demand than sort of like you said, like, putting your finger into the wind and trying to feel the next sort of breeze coming. And I think that it's a really cool sort of positioning to have as a product for you guys, because in the end, it's much better to be sort of like a middleware that's accessible from any of these different networks, rather than having to sort of make directional bets on ecosystems. Because I think that's also been a lot of the problems we've seen with Andre from Sonic. He was posting about how expensive it is to get, bridge infrastructure, to get oracles. And, this was about a year and a half ago at this point now that he tweeted this. And I think that, the cost to have these tools accessible has been driven down in a considerable way. And also, the thesis has shifted from we're going to deploy this on every single chain and sort of like make directional bets to now we're going to be accessible from all the different chains. And we're going to make sure that like, no matter if you have $1 of volume, flowing through us, or you have, 100 million, you have some type of way to get started. And I think that, for you guys, it's Pioneer, right? So if you're a small chain and you want to get access, you can plug that in and tap into, this sort of global network of liquidity and users. In the same way that you can then, if there's a lot of order flow, scale up that, towards a more trustless design and sort of the end goal. And I think for us, we had a similar realization with SEDA. We said, if we have to pick and choose where we deploy our Oracle, and then also, kind of give like a buffet option, like, hey, here are the 10 assets we're going to provide your chain, like ETH, BTC, Sol, etc. You really, sort of create a pigeonhole for the developer of what they can build and what they can sort of create. I think in the same way with bridging today, if you only have access to native assets that are on your chain, like the native token, you're quite limited in what you can build. So then, you go back to this approach like Near had as an example of this, like in the early days, they had to then try to build their own stablecoin, USN, and they were trying to build like
Yeah.
all of these different standards to create the tooling necessary for developers to come and build. And now, at day zero, you can have access to USDC and DAI and ETH and Bitcoin, whatever else you want to have. So builders can just get started. They don't need to wait for that and sort of build that core infrastructure out like you had to do in 2021 and 2022.
Yeah, definitely. Especially on the liquidity side, right? On the token side. I think that's a huge unlock that I think we're really just only scratching the surface for right now with things like OFTs and USDT zero, I think is what they call the wrap tether version for it. And we have Wormhole as well, NTTs and XLR ITS and Hyperlane warp route. So and XERC20s. So there's kind of a renaissance, so to speak, of cross-chain token standards, which I think is going to be really, really helpful in the future. And for us, we also are being very proactive with that, right? We have partnered with a team called Glacis. They, exclusive partnership, they only work with us for our order flow, but basically they aggregate all of these token standards. And so it's another tool that we can offer for new chains, right? We're saying, hey, when you launch a new chain, you can have a solver that does this. And you can have access to this intent protocol that does this. And if you still are wondering, okay, that's great, where's the liquidity? Well, then we can bring it over with Glacis, right? You can lock and mint it using any of these cross-chain token standards. And so we're trying to make it, we're trying to remove every barrier imaginable from a cross-chain perspective for a new rollup builder. And I think that will unleash an absolute renaissance of new chains and also activity between all these chains.
Yeah, I agree. And it also changes the dynamic, right? Because a lot of networks today, like back in the day, like while you're working at Aave, you probably saw this a lot. Like if you launch a new version of Aave on a network, you have to then try to find a way to incentivize people to move liquidity there, right? So maybe it's with token incentives from the foundation or some type of DeFi operation. That was super common back during like the new L1 war of DeFi summer. Now, developers are just building where they believe they have the best edge, right? And they don't care like, about these sort of incentives because they've been played out. They don't work anymore. And I think that that's like a really cool positioning for developers because they're able to just pick the infrastructure that suits them. And then the network has all of these sort of tools plug and play for them. Whereas before, you really had to kind of build where there was the liquidity. And I think you're right. The renaissance sort of is starting now for these networks. I think it's really changing the dynamic, but it's also, I think it's now enabling application specific chains. Like a network like Hyperliquid wouldn't have worked like back in 2021 because you'd say like, okay, well, I have to wait 7 days to get my assets there. Like in that time, they might be gone. Like I might miss out on opportunity. But with Lifi, with all the different aggregation of different bridges, like let's say you choose Relay as an example. You have like 1 second bridge from Ethereum to Hyperliquid, and you're good to go. And I think that that's sort of like in my opinion, is one of the clearest signs of traction that we've seen in crypto. I think there's been a few examples, like Aave is definitely one of them, right? Like lending on assets really has some product market fit, in my opinion. I think you have swaps like Uniswap, so AMMs, have proven that they have a real use case. And I think that the third real use case, I mean, it's stablecoins, I'll kind of lump into those two, right? But the
Yeah.
third real use case, in my opinion, is Interop. Like the ability to make it seamless to transfer assets between chains is probably one of the biggest unlocks that crypto has had, over the past like 10 years, in my opinion, because it really allows capital to flow freely into specific tooling that hasn't been possible before, at least in a safe and fast way.
Yeah. I think even if we zoom out of crypto, there's broadly a trend of lowering the barrier of costs for doing certain things. And I think once you do that, you open up this surface area for different use cases to happen, right?
Yeah.
Like if we genuinely lower the barrier of launching a new rollup and connecting new rollups to near zero, then everyone that wants to create a rollup for some very novel use case that they're observing can actually happen, which is really cool. And you also see that play out, I think, in space. Like I always see space as a direct analogy to Interop and blockchains in many ways, right? We're trying to connect planets and other celestial bodies together. And so if you see SpaceX, obviously they've lowered the barrier tremendously for launching rockets into space, and they carry cargo and they carry humans. And I kind of see it as like a spectrum. It's like big things will always be like government run. Middle tier is kind of SpaceX, and then small things like literally launching like the smallest satellites ever is for something like a Space Lab or an Astra, right? And
Yep.
once you lower the barrier to that, where it's only a couple $1,000s to launch something into space, you can launch a bunch of really interesting satellites into space, which gets really interesting. And you see the same thing with AI
Yeah.
as well, right? It's like AI makes software so easy to make. Now anyone can make software, and you can make software for your local, football league, right? To like track scores and stuff like that. So you can get a lot of customization through lowering the barrier of access to some of these technologies.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I still remember like my parents in the early days of the internet mailing in checks, right, to like pay
Yeah,
for things
Netflix.
like mail order, right?
Yeah,
Exactly. And I remember, like getting like Netflix DVDs in the mail and being like, okay, cool. Like, now we have these two movies that we'll watch like 100 times and then mail back in and wait, 5 days for the next one to come. And I think that's kind of like I agree with you. It's a general trend. Like another example is like the credit card with Amazon, like being able to pay within seconds really changes the dynamic of how fast consumers are willing to interact with buying a product. And even myself now, like if I have the option for Apple Pay on a website, I'm like 10 times more likely to buy something than if I have to like manually enter my credit card details, because it's just like frustrating. And I'm like, okay, is this a secure payment terminal? Like what are they using in the back end? Are they going to steal my credit card information? And I think that like maps as well, to stocks as well, right? I remember when Robinhood launched, and you could do like instant deposits, right? That they would
yeah, zero
front you the
commission.
capital, exactly, and also front you the capital, right? So you could deposit like $1,000 and have it instantly for trading. Whereas my dad with E-Trade, he'd wait like a few business days for that like wire to hit his broker account. So I think that in general we see this trend. And I think in crypto as well, I think there's been two pieces here though that I want to dive a bit deeper into. I think Pioneer is like a very good example of this. Like in the very early days of bridging and what we have right now. So if you look at layer zero, if you look at Hyperlane, etc., you sort of have a modular stack, right, that can be deployed, that you can access chains. But the sort of centralization piece that still exists is like this relay function, that happens through the chains. What we've been building with this like IBM product on SEDA is basically a totally customizable verification piece. And when we've spoken to other bridges, the main sort of catalyst is that you can configure and program exactly what you need for verification. So it's like kind of having like your own verification network, right? Plug and
Yeah,
play. I think that this is sort of like the big elephant in the room that we see right now, which is that bridging has become very easy, but a lot of the rails are still kind of dangerous in the back end. And I think Pioneer is like a cool approach to that, because you say, listen, let's not do overkill. Let's not have like 1,000 solvers launch this network, have a ton of hardware costs. Let's not, spend a huge security budget and then have like a dollar per day, right? Like through this
Yeah.
volume. Let's start something simple and then we can scale up as the demand comes. I think that's sort of like an approach that needs to be worked on a bit more in crypto, because right now there's sort of like an overkill of decentralization before product market fit. And then, decentralization sort of starts to sneak in, but also, a lot of teams make the decision not to include decentralization because it makes their, job harder or it makes it more expensive. So I'd love to get your take there. Like, do you believe that, Pioneer will transfer into like a more decentralized version for a lot of these networks? Or do you think they'll kind of like go like stay more towards decentralization because it's faster and easier for them than like, maybe managing a bunch of solvers or incentivizing solvers on this route?
You're asking in the context of Pioneer specifically, or broadly about Lifi?
Yeah, I guess in the context of Pioneer, like how you see this playing out, like as growth goes through that, and then I guess in the context of Lifi as well. I think it's more bridge decision in the context of broader Lifi, right? Like how Hyperlane, Layer Zero, Wormhole, et cetera, kind of expand their verification stack. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts, like kind of at your sort of at the level of Catalyst, how you guys will force decentralization over time and not keep it sort of more centralized.
Yeah. So I will preface and say that if you look at where the market has been trending for the past 1 or 2 years, they've certainly prioritized UX over decentralization. And you can kind of see that as it pertains to successful projects and the mechanism decisions that they've made based on the volume/traction they have, right? So it's always in the back of people's minds as builders, but certainly one could be jaded and say, okay, well, I'm just going to go all in on UX for at least the short term. For us, we are kind of in the middle area, I would say. We're pretty pragmatic and we're pretty mindful of these things. We certainly are not trying to build decentralization first and have it be very belabored and over-engineered. Something like IBC kind of comes to mind for that, right? It's amazing from a technical perspective. It is very large and complex and monolithic in many ways, and made a ton of assumptions on consensus mechanisms and what types of proofs you can have.
Yeah.
And I know Barry and the Skip team are trying to refactor that, but it is what it is, right? And that is decentralization first. And on the other end, centralization/UX first might look more like Relay, for example. Or one could even argue Layer Zero in its first iteration, right? And that they've been very successful as a result. I think for us, again, we fall in the middle. So Pioneer will always be on the UX side. It is a solver at the end of the day. There is no safeguard against a solver necessarily, but you get a lot of benefits from it for being a solver. I think Catalyst as a intent protocol operates more decentralized, where you have a solver network that would bid on intents to fulfill. And as a result, there's some self-regulating component to that, right? Where the winning solver should be also a best actor, and there's a slashing component to it from a solver performance/reputation perspective. Everything is super trust minimized in terms of on-chain transactions and relaying the proof of a state transition between different chains. And so that's kind of Catalyst. I do think even then there is a centralization trade-off where you're relying on a counterparty, right? You're relying on a solver that Catalyst has. And I do think in the future, if decentralization becomes important, we can revisit that. We can go back to something that looks more like Catalyst v1 and use something that is completely permissionless, like an AMM. I think AMMs and Stargate are great for this instance because you don't have any counterparty risk in many ways, right? And there's resiliency. I think we've seen a few solver implementations go down under periods of volatility because solvers have no incentive to provide you stale quotes, right? They're probably going to be losing money because it's outdated, even if they're providing it within a very tight time frame. And that has been a big issue for solver-based implementations, and AMMs don't have that. But again, the trade-off is huge, where you're getting a lot of the UX gains on a solver-based system versus an AMM-based system. And so they've been very successful. So I guess in summary, we're pretty pragmatic about things, but and we value decentralization in many ways. That I think kind of shows in our design of Catalyst, but we're also pretty mindful of solving needs that are present right now for users and adjusting accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great take, and it's really good to hear, because I think you know, like you said, it's sort of like building a bridge, like a physical bridge across like a river, when there's like demand from one person that goes back and forth in their boat, right? So don't over engineer.
Good
Like
analogy.
IBC is like, let's build like the strongest 8 highway, bridge across this, span of ocean. And, we're going to assume that everyone drives a specific type of car. And if they don't, oops, and I think that how you're approaching it is very pragmatic, in the fact that you're saying, listen, bridges don't want to run their own infrastructure, or sorry, networks don't want to run their own infrastructure to have bridges. They don't want to become experts in bridge security. They want something that's plug and play. They want access today, not in a year from now or 6 months from now. And I think that we talked to the relay team about this as well. It's sort of a spectrum, right? Like if it's $1 or $100, security is not as important. If it's $1 million, of course, security is much more important. So it's also a spectrum of trade-off, where, as an example, Pioneer for some networks might be enough. And, they might say, we wish that we had the demand that we would want to go towards a Catalyst model, but we just don't have the demand for that. So I think it's a really good approach that you offer both, because I agree, if you just maximize decentralization just for decentralization's sake, for sort of the industry, you may never reach traction, and your runway is limited as a startup, right? And I think by taking this approach with Pioneer, you get the best of both worlds, right? You're able to, from day one, support it, and then roll out decentralization as it matters, and the volumes increase, basically.
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you brought up the discussion topic of ticket sizes, because solver-based systems inherently have a upper bound to what they can move, right? Because if you're trying to move $10 million, realistically, no solver has $10 million in their balance sheet, or at least in one chain that they can offer to you, right? And so you're either going to have to break it apart or use something else, basically.
Yeah.
And for people that want to move $10 million, that will be a decision they will have to make, right? Well, I mean, to be fair, like I think even in a TradFi context, you're not putting in a $10 million bid into the order book. You try to break it apart for the best price execution. But even in the solver case, I think it makes sense that honestly, even 10 million was kind of egregious. Like I would even say $500,000. No solver would have that on hand. You would probably have to break it up, and that's a big trade-off. And people do want to move $500,000 at any given time.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned like 10 million size specifically, because I think it was maybe 3 months ago at this point, but I'm with my family office and LP and across, and we have a bunch of monitoring set up to monitor the pool weights. And there was like a transaction that happened. I think it was like 8.5 or 9 million that just like totally zapped the liquidity on Ethereum. It was like ETH to, I think, base or something like that. And all of a sudden, for like 2 hours, they weren't able to resettle. So then they had to manually bridge through, Circle back to Ethereum, and then be able to, reload those pools. And I think, yeah, in some ways, intense. I actually would love your opinion on this, because my co-founder Jasper has like a pretty strong opinion that solvers will eventually, like for very popular routes, will be kind of like the Citadels of the world, that they are okay making super small margins, but at extremely high frequencies, and sort of dominating a market. rather than having like solo, sort of like solver operators that are running on their server. And I think we saw a similar thing with MEV. Like it used to be, before MEV boost by flash bots, there was a lot of like independent arbitrage bots that were, competing with each other. And then MEV boost kind of like democratized that and killed it and made it like something very hard to compete in. Do you think that like, as more and more value, like let's zoom out. I mean, right now we're at, what is it, like around 20 billion, 25 billion per month in volume across all bridges, roughly. What happens when we get to like 500 billion per month? Like, do you believe that larger companies like the Citadels of the world will come in and sort of build, super, super competitive solvers and kind of dominate that? Or do you think that there will still be some, space for competition in the future on the most popular routes?
It's hard to say. I think the easiest answer is yes, that will happen. We have the analog. So you just take what happens in traditional markets and you just apply it to our specific context. Yeah, so that's kind of my thinking as it stands right now. I do think short tail will be dominated by these bigger firms. Long tail will not have the necessary business case for these firms to be there, right? Because I talk to solvers every day, and they typically have a bar of volume that they like to see between specific routes before they deploy capital, right? And even if they're not making a lot of money per se, if the margins are quite small, they still need to see volume as a justification for locking up their inventory in those specific places, right? And so if you're a fund and you manage, call it $50 million in assets, you're not really going to be deploying on a route that moves $1 million a day, right? You're not even going to be allocating a chunk of your inventory to be doing that because the opportunity cost is too high. You can simply use your money for other things. Whereas for long tail hobbyists, in many ways, they are certainly okay with $1 million per day route because, again, their cost of capital is not necessarily as high, so to speak, or maybe they're not as sophisticated about how they want to be deploying their inventory. So there will always be a case for long tail. And I observe that in even the MEV space, right? Certainly we have large searchers and large block builders that dominate, but there is long tail stuff that hobbyists can certainly capture, right? Whether it's a very fringe NFT auction or what have you, right? So certainly still room from a MEV perspective for long tail, and I think that applies to solvers. Now, I think the non-consensus take for this is to say that maybe big firms won't necessarily win. And that is because of agents, quite frankly. Like agents drastically lower the barrier for people to run solvers. And certainly, I think agentic tech is not there right now because there's a lot of manual interventions you need in order to make solving work. But I do think there will come a time where you can run agents. And if they only make 1, 2, 3 bips, that's okay because you can deploy thousands of them, right? And so it becomes kind of like an equalizing factor in many ways that allows the layperson to compete with a big fund, because even if the margins are quite low, if the volumes are high, you can simply outcompete them through sheer scale.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'd love to hear. I saw in the documentation that Catalyst features about 30-minute settlement time for solvers for rebalancing, or I guess repaying capital on a chain. It's obviously much faster than, like as an example, a cross, which takes 2 hours. What's sort of the model for settlement there? Like, how do you guys approach that in terms of trade-offs for speed, and then like allowing solvers to redeploy capital more efficiently?
Yeah. So I think there's no secret science to this, right? I don't think our mechanism is that novel in a way such that we've realized that we can lower the rebalancing time versus other mechanisms like a cross. I think for us, based on the solvers that we have onboarded, 30 minutes just makes a lot of sense for what they want to be using their capital for. And so lower capital requirements, due to quicker rebalancing, allows for more solvers to participate, basically. And for us, 30 minutes comes from basically the upper bound of a cross-chain message using any GMP. So if we use wormhole or layer 0, 30 minutes is typically pretty good. We can certainly go faster. That's perfectly fine. But I think 30 minutes is a good stake in the ground for us. Now, we could revisit it. I think for solvers, they obviously would like to rebalance more quickly, but that does come at a cost for price. And so we can revisit that decision going forward if there is feedback that we can actually increase it and therefore decrease the fees on the routes that we're charging.
Yep, makes sense. Yeah, I think this is going to be. I know there's like Nomiel that's working on stuff like this, like Enzo. I'm not sure if they're still doing this. I know they were like a few months ago, but I think their vision changed a tiny bit. But I think it will be an interesting design space. It's also something that we've been talking about a lot, like having faster sort of chain state verification will allow faster repaying for solvers. It's something that we've been happy to chat about later for the IVM with you guys. But yeah, it's super interesting. I think that there's going to be a bigger market that sort of unrolls around rebalancing for solvers, because I think right now most solvers rebalance through, like you said, like wormhole, layer 0, etc. But I feel like there may be in the future a chain purpose built, or even like a layer that's purpose built for sort of rebalancing where inventories hold. But no, that's super cool. And sort of what's your sort of thesis, I guess you could say, over the next couple of years? We've seen Interop volume grow a ton over the past couple of years. What does sort of the next couple of years look like in your mind for the Interop space? Do you see it growing like 5x, 10x, more, less? Curious to get your thoughts on
I've
that.
seen the graph in the Lifi expansion blog, and it literally goes,
Yeah.
we're here, douche.
Yeah, 100x.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard for me to speculate on the market size. I think it makes intuitive sense that if you make something incredibly easy, there's just going to be more throughput through it, which is helpful. But yeah, it's hard for me to say. I do think that if you look at DEX volume right now, which is 2 orders of magnitude greater than bridging volume on a daily basis, I would probably hope that it would lower by an order of magnitude. So yeah, a 10x on bridging volume. I think bridging is as important as swapping on a DEX, or same chain swaps as we call it in a interop context. So I think that's a pretty safe bet. I do think that in the next few years, interop is solved. I say that a lot. It's kind of my tagline at this point. I do think interop will be solved by end of year. Again, it's a semantic argument on what solved means, right? But ultimately,
I can hear Mark from layer 0 scratching.
yeah, he's eye twitching right now. I think that bridging is something that no user gives a shit about, right? It's a extra step that they just don't care about. And so if you build an abstraction to that, and you can make the argument of building abstraction towards many other things, that gets very interesting. And I would want to have bridging basically brought up to the same echelon of transactions as swapping and lending and staking, right? Those are the core 4 primitives, or I guess paying, sending too, in many ways, although it doesn't really have a contract interaction. But those are the 5 core things. I would want volume to kind of reflect that, because ultimately, if we are abstracting this stuff away, if we're using some sort of natural language agent interface layer, they're just going to do things, right? And I think we're going to achieve that very quickly. I think we're going to achieve that certainly by end of this year.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny that you say it, because I like back in 2022, I was like, if I had an asset on another chain, I would sort of eat the slippage and just trade there, right? So like if I wanted to trade, ETH to USDC on like, I don't know, Aurora, or as an example, like I would just
Oh,
say,
yeah.
okay, I'm like eating like 8% or 10%, but it's easier than like waiting 18 hours and like having to come back a second time to like, basically unlock my funds and like all this stuff right from the bridge. And now, like as an example, like when I do trading or claim, staking rewards or whatever on different chains, a lot of the time with Lifi, I just am like on one chain and swapping that asset directly to like USDC and sending to my safe on like one transaction. And it's like, I think you're right. Like I think, what the user considers bridging today, like just moving assets from one chain to another, I think will drastically change as you kind of move into this space where users are kind of using a bridge to do like that entire function together, right? Not having, because
Yeah.
like before you'd have to like move the asset, then swap it, or swap it on the first chain, then move it. And now it's just like cheaper and easier to just say like, okay, I'm putting in ETH here and getting USDC here, or other way around, and there's no need for me to like jump through the steps in between. So I use it as like my main swap interface now, rather
Yeah.
than going to the AMM directly.
Yeah. And I think what gets really interesting once you have like balance abstraction too, which is kind of like a flavor of chain abstraction.
Yeah.
You're just saying, hey, like I have USDC, I don't really care where it is, but some mechanism knows where it is and they rebalance it accordingly. You mentioned Aurora a few times. I've also had that specific issue happen to me because Rainbow Bridge has a claim at the end of it, which is very annoying. So you have to remember to claim it, which I have forgotten for many months, many times.
Yeah.
I'm curious why you bring up Rainbow Bridge. Is that like a special place in your heart?
Yeah, so we were actually the first team to launch on near mainnet back in, I guess it was like summer of 2019. Jasper and I, we built the first app for derivatives on startups. So basically letting you go directly long or short on a private company. And we were in WeWork at the time, and we were like, okay, everything doesn't make sense here. Like it was like early 2018, you could get like
In San Francisco?
free. No, it was in Germany, in
Okay.
Hamburg, and we basically were getting free food, free drinks for like paying $50 for an office, and we were like, how does this make sense? Like, and I remember we were sitting there, and then the woman who managed the WeWork came to us and said, hey, you can move to our other office in Hamburg that we just opened, and we'll give you 6 months free if you move there. And we were like, why? Like we already have a discount here. Like, why would you basically make it free for us to go there? And so we're like, okay, something doesn't make sense here. So our strategy at the time, because we, had just started out, and we said, okay, we don't know any VCs. So what we did is we went to all the VCs that passed on WeWork and said, hey, why did you pass? Did you miss out? Do you want to go long, or did you pass for a reason you can go short on WeWork now? And so that was sort of our foray into the VC market. And while we were building that, that was, at the time when, Ethereum was super slow, and we were building it on Augur. So it was like, $100 to make a transaction. We're like, okay, if, a user wants to trade $100 and they have 100% fee on top, this isn't going to work. So then we tried to figure out ways to do it with like, 0x and use DAI, which was just coming out as like a stable coin instead of ETH. And we had like this bet that, basically, alt L1s would be better experience for like users. So we actually moved to Near before their testnet was live, and built like a bunch of open market protocols, which is why we ended up building an Oracle there, because we said, okay, there's no Oracle on Near, and then a bunch of other builders started asking if they could use our Oracle on their chain or on Near, and that's kind of how we went down that route. And so Aurora was one of the first chains we launched our Oracle on, before moving to Near and a few other networks in 2021. And Rainbow Bridge was something that I used like a lot, to go from Ethereum to Near and back, and had many sleepless nights while I waited for my assets to land, on different chains.
Cool. I love the lore drop.
Yeah. What about you? Why did you use Aurora so much back in the day?
APR.
Yeah, Bastion and Origami. Yeah, Trisolaris. Yeah. So that was our initial big bet there. So we were the Oracle for Bastion and Origami back in the day.
Look, gentlemen, I want to be wary of time. I have one last question that I really want to get out. I actually had 2 pages of questions. I'm an absolute super fan of Lifi, and I will apologize for calling it Lifi for the first 30 minutes. of this recording. I'm going to see if I can AI twist that one out.
Yeah,
It's the Australian in me that, no, that's the country Australian bogan within me that needs to extend all my vowels. But I was reading again on the expansion blog. It's a great blog, Expansion 2.0 by Lifi. There it is again. Make sure to read it for anyone tuning in. But there's a sentence here that says, Catalyst is trust minimized, quote, only trust the protocol doing the verification. And I want to just dive very quickly, if you have another 5 minutes. Do you guys have like a modular verification marketplace? Is it something that's like akin to sort of the ISM's marketplace at Hyperlane or the DVN space at layer 0? Or is that something you're set to evolve a little bit?
I wouldn't call it a marketplace, so to speak. I do think there comes a time where it could be a marketplace, like a proof marketplace is definitely a pipe dream that I've had for a few years now, where, you know, you have order flow coming in with certain security requirements and different providers would effectively bid for it. And there's some sort of matching happening. I don't know if it's explicitly a bid. I think it might just be more like a smart routing algorithm, but something akin to that, right? A two-sided marketplace in many ways. But for us, we kind of give people recipes, so to speak. So we modularize the entire cross-chain stack. It is a bit of a long explanation, but to answer your question specifically, people can choose various ways in which the proof can be relayed. People meaning in this case like integrators, wallets, or other people using the order flow. Certainly the end user could do it too if they were insanely sophisticated. Although I'm probably in that camp and I personally wouldn't do it. I would just default to the defaults that whatever integrator has used. But they can choose things like GMPs, like Hyperlane, Layer 0, XLR, Wormhole, etc. They can also choose proof layers. And so they can choose something like Espresso or Astria or a ZKVM or a coprocessor, right? So we are much more agnostic on it than just GMPs, so to speak. Oracles.
Makes sense. Yeah. Go ahead, Matt.
No, it's interesting to know because I was looking online. I've been diving deep into like the ISM sort of documentation from Hyperlane and obviously like the DVN space and having a look. I mean, they announced Muon, I think it was last week, was sort of like similar kind of Oracle setup. I still haven't sort of dove too deep into that, but Canary just came out with restaking. Polyhedra is now at 25 chains, I think, for their DVN. So just sort of curious as like a follow-on from that question is like, the marketplace is a pipe dream for you. It's obviously a pipe dream for us. I mean, we're building a flagship Oracle module for it. You've been speaking to builders for years who I guess have been looking into verification. We talked a lot about removing friction from the builder, and you mentioned just before like defaulting to like, I wouldn't do it either. I would just default, which as I looked into like the DVN space, ISMs, it's very easy to default because it's very complex at this point because the market's not involved. It's not mature enough right now that to choose all your DVNs or ISMs for the different zones that you have to choose or the different chains that you want to integrate is just an absolute nightmare. So I had like a 24-hour session with Claude and the JSON file from the Layer 0 documents, trying to put it together to figure it all out. I've been there. Yeah, it's a big process. Kind of curious to see like, how do you see the modular verification? Like two questions. How do you see the verification marketplace like unfolding? Like, what's it look like from a builder's point of view? You're obviously big on the modular thesis. Second question is like your experience with builders. How many of them really care at the end of the day? Like, what's the trade-off? Like the trade-off to put my stack together versus like the security benefits I'm getting. How do you see those from those conversations you've had?
Those were only two questions.
Yeah.
Didn't you say three?
If I did, then I bundled it in.
Okay,
I'm really I'm into rebundling after.
I wasn't sure if you were going to hit me with the third one.
I have 2 pages of questions sitting right here for you, Jim. I'm trying to squeeze them all in together while I can.
So, again, this kind of goes back to my previous answer, where historically the market and users have preferred UX over decentralization. So on the piece on modular security, I think it's still a bit early, realistically, but I think it's a good thing to have in our back pockets collectively for when it becomes relevant. And there are many builders in the space that believe that will come, and they have various opinions of when that will be. So that's, I think, on that piece. When I look at something like modular security, and I don't mean it in the context of ISMs or DVNs, I mean the context of just different verification protocols, GMPs or proof layers in this case, or even oracles. I think the most important thing that builders care about from what I've asked them for the past 2.5 years are two dimensions. One, and I think this is a very clear one, a very distant one, is chain coverage. What will allow me to go on these different chains? And so that's where I think Hyperlane is very helpful because they have the permissionless model. They have a lot of long tails. I also think Layer 0 is very helpful because they can also be modular in their security so that they can support short tail chains, which they have, and they can support long tail chains very quickly as well, at least up to a certain threshold, right? So they've worked with Berachain and Monad. So they certainly are capturing the necessary chains as they're blowing up. And they've designed their architecture to allow them to move that quickly, which is great. And if you would want an intra rollup cluster mechanism like a superchain, or even like a Polymer, which is within OP Stack, and there's some certain benefits to that, whether it's from a more permissionless coverage perspective than Hyperlane, that is very helpful. The second dimension, which is still important, is cost. And so the way that a lot of these proof layers or verification layers are architected incur a gas overhead, and ideally it is as minimal as possible. So I think that's where something like honestly like a wormhole broadcast makes a lot of sense. We found Hyperlane and Layer 0 to be middle of the pack, maybe above average in terms of gas costs. Of course, you can always amortize it, right, when you're batching. But again, cheaper is always better. So we are always in the lookout for something cheaper.
Amazing I've got so many more questions, but I really want to be mindful of your time. I think we'll have to have you on for another chat as well on modular verification specifically, especially as sort of maybe as the IVM sort of gets more developed, as that design comes into fruition. It'd be great to have you back on. I'm a super fan of Lifi and really excited to see how you guys go at expansion 2.0 and incorporating Catalyst into the current model and the expansion. I guess that's kind of the theme for 2025 in Interop is expansion. That's what you're depicting with that epic graph in the blog. Yeah. Man, thank you so much for your time, and all the best with the expansion. And I guess the acquisition is now finished, so all the best at Lifi.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for the super thoughtful questions. That was fun.
Thanks so much, Jim. It's a pleasure to chat.